A police officer was driving home through the rainy streets of Seattle on Christmas Eve when he saw her. A little girl no older than 7, shivering beside a dumpster, clutching a stale sandwich as a German shepherd stood guard at her side. She whispered only one word, food, and the weight in her voice was enough to stop him in his tracks. What he discovered next would break his heart and change his life forever. What happened after will restore your faith in love, family, and second chances. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments so we can see how far this story travels. And if you believe no child should ever be left alone on Christmas night, hit that subscribe button because what you're about to hear may change the way you see the world. Christmas Eve in Seattle was never the kind of holiday scene found on postcards. The city was drenched in relentless rain that drummed against rooftops and slicked the narrow streets with a sheen of black glass. Neon lights flickered over puddles, distorted reflections rippling under the weight of each drop. The chill in the air was sharp, carried by a damp wind that seemed determined to creep through every seam in a person's coat. The sky was a low ceiling of gray clouds, heavy and unyielding, as though it pressed down on the city and its inhabitants. It was the kind of night that encouraged people to stay indoors, gathered around fireplaces or glowing Christmas trees, wrapped in the comfort of warmth and family. But not everyone in Seattle had such a place to retreat to. Officer Michael Carter, 38 years old, knew that better than most. Michael was a man built by years of duty and by scars both visible and invisible. Standing at 6 feet tall, he had the lean, muscular frame of someone who had spent much of his life training for long hours in uniform. His dark brown hair was cut short in regulation style, though at the temples, strands of premature gray had begun to show. His face bore sharp angles, a square jaw softened only slightly by a stubble he never quite managed to keep trimmed, a straight nose, and deep-set hazel eyes that carried the weight of too many sleepless nights. People often said he looked older than his age, not because of wrinkles, but because of the quiet heaviness he carried in his expression. He had once been warm and quick to laugh, but tragedy had tempered his nature, leaving him measured, cautious, and slow to trust. Michael had joined the Seattle Police Department after returning from military service, where he had worked closely with K-9 units. Those years had instilled in him both discipline and a deep respect for the loyalty of dogs, for he had seen firsthand how their courage often surpassed that of men. He had lost friends, both human and canine, during deployments overseas, and each memory was a ghost that visited him when the nights grew too long. His personal life had not been kinder. He had married young, a woman named Sarah, a nurse whose laugh had once been the brightest sound in his life. She had been tall and slender, with auburn hair she wore tied back during shifts and an air of calm that reassured everyone around her. Sarah had been the kind of person who remembered birthdays, who baked cookies for neighbors, who sat with patients long after her shift had ended because she could not bear to leave them alone. Her compassion had been her strength and her weakness, for she poured herself into others until there was little left for herself. When complications during childbirth took her life and that of their unborn son, Michael's world had collapsed. That loss hardened something inside him. He continued his work, but his laughter disappeared and his home became a hollow space. He had stopped decorating for holidays, stopped inviting people over, and filled his silence with long shifts and routine patrols. On this particular Christmas Eve, Michael's boots splashed through puddles as he crossed the parking lot of a decaying apartment block. His patrol car was parked nearby, the wipers ticking slowly against the glass, waiting for him to continue the night's duty. He tugged his heavy police jacket tighter around himself, his breath fogging in the cold air. The city was quieter than usual, as it often was during the holidays, though the police radio at his hip reminded him that not all households were peaceful behind closed doors. As he walked past the dumpsters tucked behind the building, a flicker of movement caught his attention. At first, he thought it might be a stray animal, a raccoon or perhaps a cat scavenging for scraps. But then he saw a small, thin figure crouched low, shivering under the dim glow of a flickering streetlight. His instincts as both a cop and a man long deprived of family made him pause. The figure was a child. She could not have been more than 7 years old. Her hair, a tangle of dark brown strands plastered to her pale cheeks by the rain, clung to her face. Her jacket, once purple but now faded and frayed at the sleeves, hung loosely on her small frame as though it belonged to someone else. Her shoes were mismatched, the laces trailing, soaked through so that her socks clung wetly to her ankles. She rummaged through the trash with the mechanical precision of someone who had done this many times before, pulling out containers, sniffing them, discarding some, clutching others. Michael's heart clenched at the sight. No child should know the technique of scavenging from dumpsters, especially not on Christmas Eve. Before he could speak, a low growl vibrated through the air, sharp enough to still him. Beside the girl stood a German shepherd, its fur matted by the rain but still showing the proud black and tan markings of the breed. The dog was large, about 5 years old by the look of its muscular frame, with upright ears that twitched at every sound. Its amber eyes glowed with intensity, focused squarely on Michael. The dog's ribs were faintly visible, evidence of recent hardship, but its stance was strong, protective, and alert. It stepped forward slightly, placing itself between Michael and the girl, the way a soldier might guard a comrade. The girl noticed Michael then, her wide brown eyes locked onto his face, filled with panic. She clutched a half-eaten sandwich she had just pulled from the trash to her chest, ready to run. "Hey there," Michael called softly, raising his hands just enough to show he meant no harm. His voice was deep but gentle, carrying the tone he often used when approaching frightened victims at crime scenes. "It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you." The girl froze, her gaze darting between him and the dog. The German shepherd's growl deepened, a warning. Michael recognized the stance. This was no ordinary stray. The dog had the bearing of an animal that had once been trained, though now hardened by neglect. He lowered his tone further, speaking slowly as he kept his eyes on the girl. "You don't need to be afraid. My name is Michael. I'm a police officer. I just want to make sure you're safe." His badge caught the faint reflection of the streetlight, a subtle glint of authority that seemed to confuse rather than reassure the child. She remained hunched, clutching the sandwich. Rain pattered steadily against the metal lids of the dumpsters, filling the silence between them. Finally, Michael crouched down, making himself smaller, careful not to break eye contact with either the child or the dog. "That's a beautiful dog you have," he said gently. "Strong, brave. He's protecting you, isn't he?" At the mention of the dog, the girl's lips trembled. She tightened her hold on the sandwich, her voice so quiet it nearly vanished beneath the rain. "His name is Rocky." The single admission cracked something open in the tension. Michael's hazel eyes softened. "Rocky," he repeated. "That's a good name." "And what's your name?" The girl hesitated, then whispered, "Emily." "Emily," Michael said, as if testing the sound of it. "That's a beautiful name." "I'm glad to meet you." He watched as Rocky's growl lessened to a cautious rumble, though the dog's body remained tense, its muscles coiled as if ready to spring. Michael didn't move closer, sensing that trust could not be rushed. Instead, he let the moment hang, letting the girl know she could choose whether to stay or run. The sight of her trembling fingers, raw and red from the cold, and the sight of Rocky standing like a shield before her, told Michael that whatever their story was, it was one of hardship. And he knew then, as the church bells in the distance began to chime midnight, that he could not simply walk away. Emily's name still lingered in the night air when Michael slowly rose from his crouch, careful not to make any sudden movements that might spook her or the watchful dog at her side. The rain had softened to a mist, weaving silvery threads between the three of them, and in the glow of the flickering streetlight, Michael could finally take in more details of the child who looked far too small to be out here alone. She was slight, her thin arms clutched tightly against her body as though she were trying to disappear into the oversized jacket swallowing her frame. The jacket itself had once been bright purple but now was faded and threadbare, with seams unraveling at the cuffs. Underneath, Michael caught a glimpse of a dress patterned with tiny flowers, the fabric stained and stretched from overuse. Her face was pale, cheeks hollow, lips chapped and trembling from the cold. Her eyes, wide and brown, held an unnerving maturity for her age eyes that had seen too much too soon. She looked like a child who had learned early that the world would not hand her kindness freely. Rocky stood pressed against her thigh, the German shepherd's coat damp and bristling with tension. He was a striking animal despite his condition, with black and tan fur that clung in damp clumps from the rain. His ears stood upright, constantly twitching to monitor every sound in the alley, his body coiled like a spring ready to launch. Though leaner than he should have been, his frame still suggested power, and his sharp amber eyes remained fixed on Michael, as though measuring whether he was friend or foe. There was no doubt in Michael's mind, this dog was her shield, and it would defend her without hesitation. Michael let the silence stretch, knowing that children sometimes needed more time than adults to decide if they would open their mouths. He remembered the countless times he'd responded to calls involving scared kids. Pushing too hard only made them retreat further. So he softened his stance, resting one hand on his belt but keeping the other visible at his side. "Emily," he said again gently, his voice steady, "you don't have to run. I'm not here to take anything away from you. I just want to understand." The girl's lips parted, then pressed shut again, as though she were battling with the decision to speak. Her grip on the sandwich in her hand tightened until the bread squished between her fingers. It was Rocky who seemed to tip the balance. The dog sniffed once, then leaned slightly against her leg, nudging her forward almost imperceptibly. Emily glanced down at him, then back up at Michael, and a single word slipped out. "Food." The way she said it carried no entitlement, no expectation, only desperate fact. Michael felt the word like a blade in his chest. He lowered his voice further. "How long have you been out here?" Emily's eyes darted away, watching the rain trickle down the dumpster, and for a moment Michael thought she wouldn't answer. But then she whispered, Since they said I couldn't stay." He knelt again, trying to meet her gaze, though she refused to look directly at him. "Who said you couldn't stay?" he asked softly. Emily's small shoulders hunched even more inside her jacket, and for a long while there was only the sound of Rocky's steady breathing and the hum of the rain. When she finally spoke, her words came in fragments, halting but carrying the weight of a story far too heavy for such a young girl. "I used to live with Grandma Ruth," she began, her voice thin and fragile. "She was old, and she coughed a lot, but she always made soup even when she was tired. She let me help stir it, and we'd eat together at the little table. Rocky wasn't mine then. He lived next door. His owners didn't want him much, so he came over to play. Grandma said he was a good dog and he liked me better anyway." As she spoke, her eyes softened slightly, as though recalling those moments brought a fleeting warmth. Michael kept quiet, letting her continue at her own pace. "Then, Grandma got sick. She couldn't get out of bed. She said it was just a cold, but it wasn't. She would cough all night and sometimes fall asleep without eating. I tried to help, but I didn't know what to do. One morning, she didn't wake up." Emily's voice cracked at the last words, and she buried her face against Rocky's damp fur. The dog leaned into her, pressing firmly as though to remind her she wasn't alone. Michael felt his throat tighten. He had seen death in many forms, but hearing it from the lips of a child carved a deeper wound. He wanted to reach out, to place a reassuring hand on her shoulder, but Rocky's sharp eyes warned him not to close the distance yet. Emily's words tumbled faster now, as though once she began she couldn't hold them back. "They came, people in uniforms. They said I had to go live with new families. But none of them wanted me. They said I was too quiet, too much trouble, or that Rocky couldn't come. They said he was just a dog. But he's not just a dog. He's all I have." Rocky gave a soft whine at the sound of his name, nuzzling into her side. Michael watched the girl stroke the fur between Rocky's ears, her small fingers shaking but firm in their devotion. "The last family..." Emily hesitated, then shook her head. "They didn't care. They locked Rocky outside, and when I tried to sneak him food, they yelled at me. So I left. We left. I thought, maybe if I came back here to Grandma's building, she might come back too." Her words dissolved into tears, silent at first and then sobbing, her shoulders quivering under the weight of grief. Michael's heart ached at the sight. Here was a 7-year-old child, abandoned by blood, failed by the system, clinging only to a dog who understood her pain. He had heard stories like this before, but it was different to stand in front of it, to see the hollow cheeks, the soaked clothing, the trembling body. His training urged him to call it in immediately, to follow protocol, but another part of him, the part that remembered holding Sarah's hand in hospital corridors, the part that had painted a nursery yellow only to leave it empty, knew he could not simply treat this as a case number. He had to treat her as a child. As Emily's sobs softened into hiccups, Michael spoke again, his tone carrying more conviction now. "Emily, you and Rocky don't belong out here. Not tonight, not ever. You need warmth, food, safety, and I can help with that." She sniffled, rubbing her nose with the back of her sleeve, wary eyes flicking to him. "They all say that," she murmured. "They all say they'll help." But then they send me away. Michael shook his head firmly. I'm not them. I don't make promises I can't keep. And I can promise you this, you won't have to be alone tonight. Not while I'm here. The words hung between them, fragile but steady. Emily looked into his eyes for the first time, really looked, and whatever she saw seemed to quiet the storm within her. She gave the faintest nod, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. Rocky, sensing her decision, lowered his growl completely, though his gaze on Michael remained cautious. It was the first step, the first crack in the walls Emily had built around herself. Midnight bells echoed faintly from somewhere in the city, marking the arrival of Christmas Day. For most, it was a day of celebration. For Michael, it felt like the beginning of something else, a responsibility, a chance, maybe even redemption. He extended his hand slightly, palm up, not demanding, simply offering. Emily hesitated, then placed her tiny, trembling fingers in his, still clutching the stale sandwich in her other hand. Rocky shifted forward, brushing against Michael's leg as though sealing the agreement. Michael drove slowly through the wet Seattle streets, wipers dragging across the windshield in rhythmic sweeps. The city was quiet in its own way, muffled by steady rain, but his thoughts were restless. In the rearview mirror, he could see Emily sitting rigidly in the back seat, her thin frame swallowed by her tattered purple jacket. Beside her, Rocky stretched out, his damp fur filling the car with the musky scent of wet dog. The child had pulled her knees up to her chest, clutching them as though to make herself smaller, while Rocky's head rested firmly across her lap, his amber eyes flicking toward Michael each time the car slowed at a light. To anyone else, they might have looked like a lost child and a stray dog, but Michael saw something deeper. Two survivors bound together by necessity, by loyalty, by the unspoken understanding of abandonment. His hands tightened on the wheel. He had seen many things in his years as a cop: violence, addiction, despair, but nothing struck him as crueler than a child left without someone to protect them. When they pulled into the lot in front of his building, Emily's eyes grew wider. She gazed at the squat red brick apartment complex with suspicion, her lips pressed tightly together as though bracing for bad news. "Do you live here?" she asked, her voice no louder than a whisper. Michael nodded. "Yeah. It's not fancy, but it's safe. That's what matters right now." He parked, stepped out into the drizzle, and opened the rear door for her. Emily hesitated, her hand frozen on Rocky's collar as though expecting to be told she couldn't bring him inside. Michael noticed and spoke quickly. "Rocky comes with you. He's part of this, just like you." The relief that flickered across her face was subtle but unmistakable. Inside, the stairwell smelled faintly of dust and old wood polish. Emily climbed cautiously, Rocky padding beside her, nails tapping against the worn steps. Michael trailed behind, key in hand, his mind half on the two guests he was bringing home and half on the emptiness that awaited them. His apartment had been stripped of life long ago. When Sarah died, he couldn't bear the reminders, so he had taken down the photographs, boxed away the baby clothes, and left the nursery closed. The only things left were functional: a couch, a chair, a kitchen table. He wondered how it would look through the eyes of a child who had known only loss. The door opened with a soft creak, and Emily stepped in, Rocky immediately darting ahead to sniff every corner. The light overhead buzzed before steadying, casting the room in a warm yellow glow. Emily lingered on the threshold, uncertain, until Rocky returned to nudge her hand as if saying it was safe. She moved to the couch cautiously, sitting at the very edge, her small hands clutching the hem of her jacket. Michael shed his heavy coat, tossed it on a chair, and glanced toward the kitchen. "Are you hungry?" he asked. Her nod was almost imperceptible, but the way her eyes followed him betrayed her need. He rummaged through his cabinets, pulling out a can of tomato soup and a half loaf of bread. It wasn't much, but it was warm and filling. He set a pan on the stove, the hiss of the burner filling the silence. He glanced over and caught Emily watching, her chin just above the arm of the couch, eyes darting between the food and Rocky, who sat upright beside her. "It's just soup and grilled cheese," he said gently. "Simple, but it'll do the job." When he finally set the steaming bowl and sandwich in front of her, she stared as though unable to believe it was for her. "Go ahead," Michael encouraged. She lifted the spoon carefully, took a small sip, then another. Soon she was eating with quick, efficient movements, her eyes never leaving the bowl. Rocky, obedient at her feet, waited patiently until Michael set a small plate of bread and scraps on the floor. The dog wagged his tail once in thanks before eating, his ears swiveling toward every sound in the room. Watching them, Michael felt something shift inside him, a quiet reminder of what it meant to provide, to care, to give without expecting anything in return. When Emily had finished, she sat back, cheeks flushed from the heat of the soup, and let out a small sigh that seemed far too old for her years. Michael stood, retrieving a folded blanket from the closet, and handed it to her. She clutched it tightly, pulling it around her shoulders as though wrapping herself in safety. "There's more," he said softly. "A hot bath will help warm you up. And I've got some clothes you can use for tonight." Her eyes widened, darting immediately to Rocky. Michael smiled faintly. "He'll be right outside the door. He won't leave you." In the bathroom, steam soon filled the air, and the faint sound of running water reached the living room. Michael took the opportunity to sit on the couch, Rocky positioning himself directly between him and the closed bathroom door. The German Shepherd's eyes never left Michael, his body taut with vigilance. Michael studied him in silence, impressed by the discipline evident in his posture. Rocky wasn't just a stray he had once been trained, of that Michael was certain. His protective instincts were too precise, his patience too deliberate. It made Michael wonder what stories the dog carried, just as Emily did. When the bathroom door finally creaked open, Emily emerged wearing a loose t-shirt that nearly reached her knees and a pair of sweatpants tied tightly at the waist. Her damp hair clung to her temples, her skin pink from the heat, and though she still looked fragile, there was something different about her now. She looked like a child again. Rocky bounded to her side, tail wagging furiously, sniffing her as though making sure she was truly safe. Emily smiled faintly, the first smile Michael had seen from her, and stroked his fur. Michael cleared his throat. "You can sleep here tonight," he said, gesturing to the couch. "It's not big, but it'll be warm. I'll grab another blanket for Rocky, though I doubt he'll use it." Emily pulled the blanket tighter around herself, eyes heavy with exhaustion. She murmured something that Michael barely caught. "Thank you," before curling up against Rocky's side. Within minutes, her breathing evened, her small hand resting on the dog's thick fur. Michael remained seated across the room, the lamp casting a pool of light around them. He watched the child and her guardian, both survivors, both fragile yet unyielding. His apartment had been empty for years, stripped of joy and memory, but tonight it felt different. The silence wasn't hollow anymore. It was alive with the sound of trust slowly taking root. For the first time in 3 years, Michael allowed himself to exhale fully. Tomorrow would bring complications, calls to social services, questions he wasn't ready to answer. But tonight, on Christmas night, 2 weary souls had found a measure of safety under his roof, and he, in turn, had found something he thought he had lost forever: the faint stirrings of purpose. Morning came late to Seattle, gray light struggling to cut through the heavy clouds outside Michael's apartment. The steady patter of rain against the window was softer than the downpour the night before, but it still carried that familiar chill that seemed to seep into bones. Michael sat at the small kitchen table, sipping black coffee, his thoughts restless as he glanced at the couch where Emily still slept. She was curled tightly under the blanket he had given her, her head pressed against Rocky's flank. The dog lay stretched out beside her, ears flicking now and then at the sound of the city waking beyond the thin walls. For a moment, Michael let himself appreciate the strange sense of calm filling his apartment. After years of silence, there was breathing other than his own, and it made the place feel alive again. But calm never lasted long in his world. Emily stirred, blinking awake slowly, her hair a messy halo around her face. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, then froze as if suddenly remembering she wasn't where she expected to be. Her gaze darted around the bare apartment, then landed on Michael. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Rocky stretched, gave a sharp yawn, and nudged her with his nose, grounding her back to reality. Michael set his mug down. "Morning," he said gently. "How'd you sleep?" Emily shrugged, not meeting his eyes. "Okay." Her voice was hoarse from sleep, but steadier than last night. Michael gestured to the kitchen. "I've got oatmeal. Not exactly Christmas breakfast, but it's warm." As Emily ate at the table, Rocky sprawled at her feet, eyes scanning the room with unrelenting watchfulness. Michael studied the pair, noting again the way the dog deferred to her, waiting for her cues. He was more than a pet, he was her partner, her guardian. Michael had known K-9 units with less discipline. It made him curious. Where had Rocky come from? Who had trained him before he ended up at the side of a 7-year-old? He decided not to press her yet. One step at a time. Later, after dishes were cleared, Michael suggested they get some fresh air. Emily looked uneasy at the thought of leaving the apartment, but Rocky wagged his tail eagerly, and eventually she agreed. The streets were damp, puddles forming in every crack, the smell of wet asphalt strong. Emily clutched Rocky's leash with both hands as they walked down the block. She was quiet, her gaze constantly sweeping, as though expecting someone to appear. Michael kept a steady pace beside them, his police instincts tuned as sharply as Rocky's ears. It was at the small corner market that trouble found them. Michael had planned only to grab a few basics, milk, bread, fruit. But as they left the store, arms full of paper bags, he noticed a figure lingering near the alley across the street. Tall, broad-shouldered, his clothes ragged and his face unshaven, the man leaned against a lamppost with the kind of restless energy that screamed unease. His eyes locked on Emily the moment she stepped into view. Emily froze, color draining from her face. She gripped Rocky's leash tighter, her body trembling. The dog immediately went rigid, fur bristling, a low growl vibrating in his chest. The man pushed off the lamppost, stumbling a step forward. "Emily!" His voice was rough, slurred slightly as though soaked in alcohol. Emily's lips trembled. She whispered so low Michael barely heard her. "That's him." Michael's jaw clenched. He had heard enough stories from the girl to recognize what she meant. This was her father. The man approached, his eyes darting to Michael with hostility, then back to the child. He was in his early 40s, perhaps, with sunken cheeks, hollow eyes rimmed red, and a scruffy beard peppered with gray. His clothes hung loose on his thin frame, the faded jacket unzipped despite the cold, exposing a stained shirt beneath. He reeked of stale beer and cigarette smoke even from several feet away. "Emily, come on," he barked, forcing a smile that never reached his eyes. "I've been looking for you. You shouldn't be with strangers." Emily backed up instinctively, Rocky stepping forward to place himself between her and the man, teeth bared. The growl turned into a sharp bark that echoed off the walls. People on the sidewalk turned to look, but hurried past, not wanting to get involved. Michael set the grocery bags down calmly, though his entire body was taut. "Stay back," he ordered, his voice carrying the authority of his badge. "She's not going anywhere with you." The man sneered. "And who the hell are you?" "Some cop thinks he can play daddy?" "That's my daughter." His voice cracked, anger and desperation bleeding into every syllable. Emily's breathing turned shallow. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, eyes brimming with tears. "No, I don't want to go." Michael stepped closer, his hand resting near his belt, though he didn't draw his weapon. "You need to leave," he said firmly. "Right now. If you care at all about her, you'll walk away before this gets worse." The man's eyes flicked between Michael and Rocky, who was snarling now, every muscle ready to spring. For a tense moment, it seemed he might lunge anyway, but then he spat on the ground and retreated a few steps. "This isn't over," he muttered, pointing a shaking finger at Michael. "She's mine. You'll see." Then he turned, staggering into the alley until his figure disappeared. Emily collapsed to her knees, clutching Rocky's fur, her body shaking with silent sobs. The dog licked her hand, whined softly, and pressed his body against her. Michael crouched beside her, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "He's not taking you anywhere," he said, voice low but certain. "Not while I'm here." "Do you understand?" Emily nodded through tears, clinging to Rocky as though her life depended on it. In truth, it probably did. When they returned to the apartment, Emily was quiet, her small face pale. Rocky followed her every move, refusing to leave her side. Michael poured her a glass of milk, set it in front of her, then stepped aside to call someone he knew he could trust. His friend Laura Mitchell answered after a few rings. Laura was a social worker he had met years ago during a joint case involving foster children. She was in her mid-30s, tall with dark curly hair and sharp gray eyes that missed little. She carried herself with brisk confidence, her voice clear and firm, but Michael knew beneath her professional armor was a heart that ached each time the system failed a child. "Michael?" "It's Christmas Day," Laura said, though without judgment. "What's going on?" He told her everything, from finding Emily behind the dumpster to the confrontation outside the market. On the other end of the line, Laura was quiet for a moment, then sighed heavily. "This is bad. If her father resurfaces, he can make trouble even if he's unfit. You need to be careful. I'll see what I can do to start the process for emergency custody, but you'll need evidence, Michael. You'll need to show she's safer with you than anywhere else." Michael glanced at the couch where Emily sat with Rocky curled protectively at her side. He thought of her words, her trembling voice when she had said she didn't want to go. "I'll get whatever evidence you need," he said firmly, "but I'm not letting him near her again." The following week unfolded in a blur of obligations, court filings, and conversations that left Michael more drained than any shift on the force. What had begun as a single act of compassion on Christmas Eve was now pulling him deeper into a system he knew all too well, a system where children like Emily were often shuffled like paperwork rather than treated as human beings. His resolve, however, only hardened. He had seen the fear in her eyes when her father appeared and the way Rocky had planted himself like an immovable wall between her and danger. That image alone was enough to drive him through the bureaucratic labyrinth ahead. Laura Mitchell was true to her word. She arranged for an emergency hearing, though she warned Michael it would not be easy. "The courts have to consider biological ties," she told him during one late-night call, her voice edged with fatigue but steady. Laura was in her mid-30s, tall and lean, with sharp gray eyes framed by glasses she often pushed up when agitated. Her hair, a dark mass of curls, was usually tied in a bun that had begun to look permanently frazzled after years of chasing deadlines and fighting red tape. She had once confessed to Michael over drinks that she carried the faces of dozens of children in her memory kids she couldn't save, cases where the system had failed. It was what made her relentless, but also weary in a way only someone who had seen too much could understand. "You need to be prepared," she said. "Her father may be unfit, but he'll try to use the law in his favor." Michael had nodded, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles whitened. "Then I'll be ready." The day of the hearing arrived sooner than he expected. The courthouse loomed in downtown Seattle, a block of gray stone streaked dark from years of rain. Inside, the air was cool, the faint smell of old paper and polished wood clinging to the hallways. Michael walked beside Emily, who wore a borrowed dress Laura had found for her. It was plain but clean, pale blue with a ribbon at the waist, and though it fit her small frame, she tugged nervously at the sleeves. Rocky padded faithfully at her side, though technically dogs were not permitted in the courthouse. Michael had secured special permission after explaining Rocky's role as Emily's emotional support, a detail Laura had fought for fiercely. They were ushered into the courtroom, where the atmosphere felt heavier than the air outside. Judge Patricia Hernandez presided at the bench, a woman in her early 50s with olive-toned skin and a steady, commanding presence. Her black robe hung neatly, and her hair, streaked with silver, was tied back in a bun that emphasized her sharp cheekbones. She was known among her peers for her fairness, but also for her intolerance of evasions. In her 15 years on the family court bench, she had seen parents lie, children cry, and guardians break under pressure. Nothing surprised her anymore. Yet she had a reputation for cutting through theatrics to reach what was best for the child. To one side of the room sat Emily's father. Up close, he looked even more ragged than before. His hollow cheeks and jittery movements betrayed his addictions, though he had tried to clean himself up for the occasion. His beard was trimmed unevenly, his hair slicked back, his shirt ironed though the cuffs were frayed. His eyes, however, could not be disguised bloodshot, restless, darting about the room like a trapped animal. Seated beside him was a court-appointed attorney, a young man in his late 20s with sandy blonde hair and a nervous demeanor, clearly fresh out of law school. He shuffled his papers and whispered furiously to his client, but the older man waved him off impatiently. Michael sat with Laura on the opposite side. Emily nestled between them, clutching Rocky's collar for courage. The dog lay at her feet, ears pricked, his gaze fixed on every movement of her father. A low rumble of a growl vibrated in his chest, but Emily soothed him with a gentle touch. Michael felt a swell of pride at her composure. She was terrified, yes, but she was holding her ground. The proceedings began. Judge Hernandez addressed both parties, her voice calm but authoritative. "This court is tasked with determining what is in the best interest of the child, Emily Parker. Biological ties are a factor, but they are not the only factor. The child's safety, well-being, and stability must be weighed heavily. Emily's father rose first, his voice rough but rehearsed. He spoke of regret, of wanting a second chance, of being her rightful guardian. "She's my blood," he insisted, hands trembling as he gestured. "I can take care of her now. I've made mistakes, but I'm ready to change." His attorney nodded eagerly, though the man's gaze darted nervously whenever Rocky's growl deepened. Laura countered with measured precision. She presented documentation of his criminal history: assault, neglect, multiple arrests for disorderly conduct. She spoke of his unstable housing, his lack of employment, his ongoing battles with substance abuse. Her words painted a picture that was damning, but factual. Then she shifted focus to Michael. She presented his record as a police officer, his stable employment, his housing. She noted his immediate willingness to provide shelter, food, and protection for Emily, emphasizing that she had been thriving in his care even within a short span of time. Judge Hernandez listened, expression unreadable, her pen tapping lightly against her notebook. Then she addressed Emily directly, her tone softening. "Young lady, do you wish to speak?" Emily's small hands shook, but she stood, Rocky rising with her, his body brushing hers like a shadow. She looked at the judge, her brown eyes wide but steady. "I don't want to go with him," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "He never wanted me before. He yelled, he left me. But Officer Carter, he keeps me safe. And Rocky too. They don't make me feel like I'm a mistake." A ripple went through the courtroom, a hush that settled even on her father's restless shifting. Judge Hernandez studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you, Emily. That was very brave." The hearing stretched on for hours, with testimony from a teacher who described Emily's withdrawn behavior at school before she disappeared, and from a neighbor who recalled hearing shouting from her father's apartment. Michael himself was called to speak. He stood tall, his police uniform pressed, his hazel eyes steady. "I didn't go looking for this," he admitted, "but when I found Emily behind that dumpster, I couldn't walk away. No child should be left like that. I know what loss feels like. I know what it means to think your future is gone, but she deserves better. She deserves stability. She deserves to feel chosen." By the time the session adjourned, the tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Judge Hernandez announced she would review the evidence and testimony before issuing her decision, but her expression betrayed something, perhaps sympathy, perhaps recognition of the truth. Emily's father stormed out, muttering under his breath, his attorney trailing behind him. Michael exhaled slowly, the adrenaline draining from his system. Emily sank back into her chair, exhausted, her hand never leaving Rocky's fur. As they left the courthouse, Laura placed a hand on Michael's arm. "You did well," she said, her sharp eyes softer now. "Whatever happens, you gave her a voice today. That matters." Michael nodded, but his mind was fixed on Emily's words. She had stood up in front of strangers, in front of the man who had abandoned her and claimed what she wanted: safety, love, and a family. That kind of courage deserved to be answered with unwavering commitment. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and polish as Michael led Emily through its wide corridor the following week. The rain had finally given Seattle a brief reprieve, pale sunlight filtering through tall windows that lined the hall. Emily wore the same pale blue dress as before, though Laura had added a small white cardigan to keep her warm. She looked more composed this time, her brown eyes focused ahead, her hand firmly gripping Rocky's leash. The German shepherd walked proudly at her side, his coat brushed until it gleamed, his ears erect as if he too understood the gravity of the day. Michael had polished his badge, his uniform crisp, his posture erect with the dignity of a man who had prepared himself for a fight that mattered more than any he had faced in his years on the force. Inside the courtroom, the familiar figures waited. Judge Patricia Hernandez sat at the bench, her black robe neat as always, her face unreadable. To her left sat the clerk, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and narrow spectacles perched low on his nose, shuffling papers with meticulous care. Across the aisle, Emily's father slouched in his seat, his jaw clenched tight. Though he had attempted to tidy himself again, the effect was unconvincing. His tie was crooked, his shirt collar wilted. The lines on his face looked deeper, the twitch in his hands more obvious, as though each day of waiting had gnawed at him. His young attorney fidgeted with a stack of notes, avoiding direct eye contact with the judge. Michael, Laura, Emily, and Rocky settled on the opposite side. Laura leaned toward Michael, whispering, "This is it. She's reviewed everything. Whatever happens, she'll decide today." Laura looked tired but resolute, her curly hair pinned back more neatly than usual, a gesture of respect for the occasion. She had fought dozens of these battles, but the way she kept glancing at Emily betrayed how invested she had become in this particular case. Judge Hernandez cleared her throat, the sound echoing through the room. "We are here to deliver a ruling regarding custody of Emily Parker." Her eyes swept the courtroom, resting briefly on the child before continuing. "I have reviewed the testimonies, the documentation provided by both parties, and the statements made during our previous hearing." She paused, tapping her pen once against the desk. "Mr. Parker, do you wish to say anything before I issue my decision?" Emily's father pushed himself up, his voice raw with desperation. "She's my daughter," he insisted, his hand shaking. "I know I've made mistakes, but blood should matter. She belongs with me, not with some cop who found her in the street. I can change. I deserve a second chance." His words carried force, but the hollowness behind them was plain. The judge listened without expression, then nodded once. "Thank you. Sit down." She turned to Michael. "Officer Carter, do you wish to speak again?" Michael stood, his boots heavy against the wood floor. His hazel eyes met the judge's steadily. "I don't claim to replace the family she lost. I don't claim to erase the pain, but I can give her safety, stability, and love. Since the night I found her, Emily hasn't asked for much, only to feel like she belongs somewhere. I can give her that. And with Rocky, she already has a protector she trusts. I just want to make sure neither of them has to be afraid again." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of his conviction. Judge Hernandez leaned back, her eyes shifting to Emily. "Emily, would you like to say anything?" Emily's small hands trembled on Rocky's leash, but she rose slowly. Rocky stood with her, his body pressed against her leg, his amber eyes steady on the bench as if he too were making a statement. Emily took a deep breath. "I want to stay with Officer Carter," she said, her voice thin but clear. "He doesn't make promises he can't keep. He keeps me safe. And Rocky's my family too. Please don't make us go away from him." A ripple of emotion moved through the courtroom, even the clerk adjusting his spectacles to hide the glint in his eyes. Judge Hernandez set down her pen, folding her hands. "I have considered carefully," she said at last. "While biological ties are important, they cannot outweigh the demonstrated evidence of neglect and instability. Mr. Parker, you have shown neither the means nor the consistent behavior to provide a safe environment for your daughter. Emily's testimony and the supporting evidence from Officer Carter and Ms. Mitchell indicate that her well-being is best served under their care. Therefore, I grant Officer Michael Carter full legal custody of Emily Parker, effective immediately. Furthermore, Rocky will remain as her registered emotional support animal, protected under the law." She lifted the gavel and brought it down with a firm strike. "This case is closed." Emily's father erupted, slamming his fist against the table, but the bailiff, a tall man with a shaved head and broad shoulders, moved swiftly to intervene. With a glare, the judge signaled for order, and the man was escorted out, muttering curses under his breath. Emily flinched at the sound but clung tighter to Rocky, who growled low, his body tense until the man was gone. Then it was over. Emily turned to Michael, her face breaking into a smile that reached her eyes for the first time since he had met her. "We did it," she whispered. Tears blurred Michael's vision as he bent down, pulling her and Rocky into an embrace. "Yes," he said, his voice thick. "We did it." Outside the courthouse, the pale sunlight had broken through the clouds. The city, washed clean by days of rain, gleamed faintly. Laura walked beside them, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. "You're officially a family now," she said with a small smile. "Don't forget it's not the end, though. Healing takes time, but you've both already started." She bent down to stroke Rocky's head. "And you, big guy, you've done half the work already." Rocky licked her hand, tail thumping. That evening, Michael brought home Chinese takeout, a tradition he hadn't followed since Sarah had been alive. He laid out cartons on the table, and Emily ate with bright curiosity, laughing softly when Rocky tried to sneak an egg roll from the edge. After dinner, she presented Michael with a folded piece of paper she had been hiding in her cardigan pocket. Inside was a drawing in colored pencil, 3 figures holding hands in front of a small house. one tall man, one little girl, and a large dog with upright ears. Above it, in careful block letters, she had written, "My family." Michael knelt, holding the paper in both hands as tears welled again. "It's perfect," he whispered. He pinned it to the refrigerator, where it would remain as the first piece of artwork his home had displayed in years. Later, as Emily curled into bed with Rocky pressed against her side, Michael lingered at the doorway. He thought of Sarah, her auburn hair and gentle smile, the way she had always believed he was capable of more than he ever thought himself. For the first time, he felt he might be living up to her belief. He turned off the light, leaving Emily safe in the warmth of a home that finally felt like one again. Sometimes the greatest miracles are not written in the sky but found in the quiet choices we make here on earth. Michael thought he had lost everything, yet on a cold and rainy Christmas Eve, God placed Emily and Rocky in his path. What began as an act of compassion became the rebirth of a family. It reminds us that even in our darkest nights, the Lord can send light in the most unexpected ways. Every day, we walk past people carrying silent burdens. A simple moment of kindness may be the very miracle they have been praying for. Just as Michael opened his heart to Emily and Rocky, we too are called to see, to care, and to choose love over indifference. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and tell us what miracles you have seen in your own life. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel so that together we can spread stories of faith, love, and redemption. And as you watch, may God bless you and your family with strength, comfort, and joy. If you believe that every child deserves to be chosen and loved, write Amen in the comments. Let it be our prayer together, a small word of faith that carries great power.